The chemical in the tap water of the people living in Lake Mary, Sanford, and Seminole County, it comes from deep underground in this place called the Floridan aquifer. It's a rocky place full of water, full of rainwater, and it's where Central Florida gets most of its drinking water. But the story that's important here is how the chemical that is contaminating drinking water in Seminole County, how it got there. The stuff is called 1,4-dioxane, and most people have never heard of it.
Anyone who lives in the US has probably been exposed to this chemical at some point. It's in personal care products, it's in shampoo, it's in cleaning products, like hundreds and hundreds of products. And federal authorities categorize it as a likely carcinogen, which means it's likely that it causes cancer. Now, we've really only proven that in animal studies and rodent studies, but the strongest evidence shows that it impacts the livers and the kidneys.
It's kind of a boutique chemical from an industrial standpoint, and it has some remarkable characteristics or properties. It can dissolve completely into water and become essentially water. Sanford's water wells have been pulling up 1,4-dioxane. And they hired an expert consultant to try to figure out where 1,4-dioxane is underground. And the map they drew, this map, depicts 1,4-dioxane in the ground or deep underground, starting at the Siemens telephone component factory. So down at the bottom in this map is where the Siemens plant was. It's between Reinhardt Road and Interstate 4. A side note to that is that the same map drawn by Sanford's expert shows that plume of poison underground is also moved to the west far enough to wrap around a few of Seminole County's drinking wells. There's some contention here. Siemens and other former owners of the plant say that no, there's no proof that the 1,4-dioxane that has gone to the north is from the factory. And this is where Sanford wants the state of Florida to step in and once and for all figure out where this chemical is and where it came from and who should deal with it as far as cleaning it up.
In 1968, General Dynamics, which at the time was one of the largest defense contractors in the United States, they purchased about 56 acres of old scrubland and old citrus groves near what is today Lake Mary, just off of where Reinhardt Road sits today. The property was basically out in the middle of nowhere, and they built an 89,000 square foot plant. The reason for the plant was that so Stromberg Carlson, a subsidiary of General Dynamics, could build circuit boards for telephone equipment. At the time, General Dynamics scored a big contract with the Walt Disney Company, and at that time, Walt Disney was planning to build its Magic Kingdom theme park there, which wouldn't open until about 3 years later. For Seminole County, it was a big win, because at that time, Seminole County was trying to move away from Orange County's shadow and start building its own high-tech corridor in that area. Now, what Stromberg Carlson did at the time was they manufactured circuit boards and telephone switching equipment. This is going back to the old rotary phones and push-button phones. And when someone would make a call, the switching equipment would transfer the call from the caller to the receiver. And that's what the circuit boards would do. By the early 1980s, there was over 1,600 employees at this facility, including engineers, designers, and factory workers. The company, General Dynamics, sold this Stromberg Carlson facility over to a British company called Plessey. And eventually, by 2001, the Siemens Corporation is now the owner of the property and also the manufacturing facility. Today, it looks much, much different. There are hospitals out there by Orlando Health. There are several new home subdivisions. So it doesn't look anything at all today like it did back in the 1970s and 1980s.
But from the late 1960s up until it closed in 2003, there was a period of time when it used solvents, chlorinated solvents, which are known to be very harmful to humans. Meanwhile, 1,4-dioxin would be added to other chemicals so that those chemicals did not dissolve or destroy newly made components at the Siemens plant in Lake Mary.
Every day, this assembly line would be working, sometimes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These manufactured circuit boards would come right off the assembly line. They would be cleaned, packaged, and delivered out to the clients. And then eventually these old solvents were put into these 55-gallon metal drums. These old metal drums were stored outside. They were sometimes stacked. And eventually, when the piles became too big, they were moved to other areas of the property. One of the employees that we spoke with had said that many times as these barrels were stacked, that after a rainstorm, they could actually smell these solvents leaking from these 55-gallon drums.
There's a lawsuit that says it was disposed of in other ways, that used chemicals were taken outside and just thrown on the ground with the expectation that they would evaporate into the air. And there's other indications that it was simply poured into drains, local sewer drains. In the end, it's not clear how it got into the ground, but it did. And when investigators went in there in the early 2000s, they found the most concentrated pockets of chlorinated solvents and 1,4-dioxin directly beneath the factory floor. In 2001, the city of Lake Mary dug a new drinking water well. And when they did that, they tested it and they found bad stuff, chlorinated solvents. But they never thought to look for 1,4-dioxane in that mess of chemicals in that newly drilled water well. So the owners of the Siemens plant agreed with Lake Mary to build a really fancy water treatment system that would remove chlorinated solvents from that well water. And by 2005, that system was turned on, and they started using it. And they used it heavily for years. What they didn't know was that it was full of 1,4-dioxane that infiltrated the entire water system of Lake Mary and went to all homes and businesses and schools in the city.
But at this point, there's people that have been exposed and they can't be unexposed. Of course, the bigger concern is when it seeps into drinking water from these industrial sites, because there has never been a study on the impact of drinking 1,4-dioxane in humans, despite the fact that millions of Americans have this chemical in their drinking water. There's an advisory level set by the State Department of Health, but it's not binding in any way. There's not really consequences if you go over that level, if that level's higher in your water supply. There's really no uniform regulations for this, and we don't know at what level it might cause cancer. There are some states like New York that have set limits for 1,4-dioxane in cosmetic products and in drinking water, but the numbers being thrown out by different regulatory agencies around the world are pretty different.
But the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has deemed it likely to cause cancer. And so they have set a very low limit, a very tiny concentration that they say is okay in drinking water. And it's kind of hard to wrap your head around this, but they measure that very tiny concentration as less than 1 part per billion, or in other words, less than 1 part 1,4-dioxane to 1 billion parts of water. They set the limit at 0.35 parts per billion. It's incredibly tiny. And that equates to about 1 8-ounce cup of 1,4-dioxane in 150 million gallons of water. So the research is not great as far as what 1,4-dioxane does for human health. That research needs an upgrade. And Yale University has recently started a big investigation on what health concerns arise from 1,4-dioxane.
So they're going to monitor people that have been exposed to it over the long term to see if they can get a cause and effect relationship, to see if they can find evidence that it is causing cancer in people or kidney or liver toxicity. They're also going to try to find some biomarkers and be able to link that. And this is really the first time that there's been a concerted effort to take this chemical seriously after decades and decades of knowing that it is likely to cause cancer in humans. But we're not going to have answers until 2027. So science is sort of playing catch up.
So even when 1,4-dioxane was discovered in 2013 in Seminole County, nobody knew what to do really. There were no regulations for 1,4-dioxane in drinking water. The 3 utilities in Seminole County were perplexed, shocked. They reached out to the state for help, and they didn't really get any for a couple of years. They got no direction. They all acted independently. They didn't collaborate with each other. And basically what they did was they turned off the wells, the drinking water wells that had the most 1,4-dioxane in them. By doing that, they reduced the levels of 1,4-dioxane substantially, but Lake Mary still had quite a bit in its drinking water. The thing about 1,4-dioxane is that because it dissolves completely into water, it can move pretty freely underground in the Floridan aquifer, and it's hard to get out. But when utilities pump it up in their drinking water wells, the standard approach to treating water in much of Florida absolutely does not work for 1,4-dioxane. It is a really tough chemical to get out of drinking water. What it requires is some of the most advanced treatment you'll find in all of Florida. It relies on dosing water with hydrogen peroxide and then cooking that water with a strong dose of ultraviolet light. In that fashion, it burns out, so to speak, the 1,4-dioxane. But no ordinary water treatment plant in Florida can do that. So here we are today, and a lot needs to be resolved yet in terms of identifying where 1,4-dioxane is moving underground, what the concentrations are, and what to do about it. Sanford's practically in a panic about this. Lake Mary has a brand new water treatment plant that cost a lot. It was paid for by Siemens. It cost an estimated $40 million. But going forward, if there's anything that might come of this, it seems that Florida goes through these convulsions where they have chemical spills or environmental mishaps of some sort, and that results in the legislature coming up with a law that mandates more transparency. That is, if in certain circumstances you have a chemical spill or other kind of environmental contamination, then you have to report it. You have to be transparent about it. In the case of Seminole County, where people in the know, people who are expert with water, they had no idea about 1,4-dioxane. And I think very clearly almost no residents in Seminole County knew of 1,4-dioxane in their water. But meanwhile, where the Siemens plant is in West Lake Mary, there's a lot of redevelopment going on, so the landscape is being altered entirely. A hospital is being built, and apartments, assisted living. It's incredibly different there now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. The whole episode is literally being paved over, almost to be forgotten before anybody even really knew what happened there.